Chapter 8. Not So Special. Trying out a new plan can be scary, but if you don't try it out, you can't find out if it's going to work. So Thursday morning, right after attendance and the Pledge of Allegiance and the announcements, I put my hand up and waited for Mrs. Snaven to call on me. She said, "Yes, Jake?" And I took a deep breath and I said, "Mrs. Snaven, you know how you were having trouble with the computers? Well, I think that if we wanted to use them for math today, then you should really ask Shelley. She knows a lot more about computers than I do, and Ben too. He's good with programs. They could really help. Then maybe we could use the computers for math even before you finish your computer class, because they're a lot more fun to use than worksheets." Mrs. Snaven said, "Maybe after reading there'll be some time to work on them. Does that sound good to everyone?" And a lot of kids in the class nodded and said, "Yes." Then Mrs. Snaven said, "That was a good idea, Jake, thank you," and she smiled at me. And I didn't care if she smiled at me, because it was a good idea. And I didn't care if the whole class saw her smile at me, because there's nothing wrong with being glad about a good idea, right? And sharing a good idea didn't make me a teacher's pet, right? It just made me myself. And that was my big idea from the night before, to just be myself and not think about being a teacher's pet. Because if I know I'm not a teacher's pet, then I'm not, right? But it's tricky, because if you get treated special, everyone will still think you're a teacher's pet. That's what kids hate, when a kid gets treated special. But it's not fair, because it's not fair, and it's really not, because a teacher is supposed to treat all the kids the same. After reading, Mrs. Snaven had to send some lunch money to the office, and I asked her if I could take it. Not because I was a teacher's pet. I wanted to go to the office for another reason. When I got to the office, I gave the money to the school secretary, and then I said, "Is Mrs. Carp busy?" Mrs. Drinkwater looked at me from behind the counter and said, "Yes, Jake, just sit down over there a minute." So I sat down and gulped, because even when you're not in trouble, waiting to see the principal is no fun. A couple of minutes later, Mrs. Carp came out, and when she saw me, she got this big smile on her face. She said, "Come into my office, Jake," and when I did, she sat down, and I was glad she did. Mrs. Carp is so tall that she's extra scary until she sits down. Then she asked, "Now what can I do for you?" I gulped again, and I said, "I'm having a problem. Ever since Monday, things have been happening to me. Things that make me things that make all the other kids think I'm a big teacher's pet." Then I stopped to look at her face. I wanted to make sure she didn't look mad or anything, and she didn't, so I kept talking. "Because I'm not a teacher's pet, I'm just a regular kid. But if everyone thinks I am, then that's bad, right?" Mrs. Carp nodded her head slowly and said, "Yes, I can see how that would be a problem. And teachers should not be giving special privileges to children. Are some teachers treating you special?" And I said, "Well, kind of, sometimes, I think." And Mrs. Carp leaned forward in her chair and said, "Really? When? And who?" And I gulped extra hard and I said, "Like on Tuesday, with you." "What? What are you talking about?" Mrs. Carp looked kind of angry, but I couldn't stop in the middle. So I told her about me starting that fight on the playground, about pushing that fifth grader, and about how the other kids got in trouble and I didn't, because she said she knew it wasn't my fault when it really was. Mrs. Carp leaned back and put her fingertips together. "Ah, yes, I can see how that would be a problem, even though I didn't see you push anyone. And before that, the assembly, and then the lunchroom business. My goodness, this has been quite a week for you, hasn't it, Jake?" And I nodded and said, "Yeah, really." Mrs. Carp stood up and walked around her desk. "Well, you'd better get back to class, Jake. We'll do some thinking about this. Maybe we can talk some more at lunchtime." "At lunchtime?" I asked. "Should I come to the office then?" Mrs. Carp was quiet a moment, and then she said, "No, I'll come and find you, all right. And I'm glad you were brave enough to come and talk to me." And I could tell Mrs. Carp kind of wanted to pat me on the head, but she didn't, and I was glad. When I got back to the classroom, it was free period. Some of the kids were reading, some were drawing or building with Lego blocks, and Shelley and Ben were working on the computers. I went back and stood next to Ben, looking over his shoulder at the screen. When he saw me, I asked, "Fixed it yet?" He didn't take his eyes off the screen. "Yeah, it was simple, but I'm pretending it was real hard." "It's real hard. That way I might get to come in over lunchtime. Then I can play a game." Ben took his hand off the keys and reached into his pocket, looking around to be sure Mrs. Snaven wasn't watching. He pulled out a CD-ROM and showed it to me. It was BAT-TLE. It was Battle Tanks. I always have a copy of this with me just in case, and he grinned. It was Thursday, so we didn't have art or gym. After free time, we watched a social studies video about these explorers named Lewis and Clark. And it was this long adventure story. It was like this long adventure story, except it was all true. The morning was great, and the best part was I could tell the kids in my class didn't think I was the teacher's pet anymore. But the minute I went out into the hallway to go to lunch, some kids from Mrs. Frule's room saw me, and this boy said, "Hey, look, it's Jakey Drakey. Gonna eat lunch with your girlfriend, Miss Cott, today?" And then 3 or 4 fifth-grade kids started saying, "Jake Drake, Jake Drake, Jake Drake." And one of the boys knocked my lunch out of my hands, and an apple rolled out of the bag. I wanted to start punching people, but I didn't. As I picked up my lunch and headed for the cafeteria, I thought, maybe things are better in my own classroom, but what about all the other kids and all the other teachers? It felt like everyone else in the school was going to think I was a teacher's pet for the rest of my life. Chapter 9. Crash landing, but safe. The lunchroom wasn't any better. In the milk line, a 4th grader asked me how come I wasn't cleaning tables yet. Then a 5th grade kid said, "Hey, look, it's the original garbage guy." And when I was walking over to where Willie was sitting, a girl in Miss Frule's class said, "Hey, Jake, Miss Cott was talking about you in art class today. She said you are so sweet." And then a whole bunch of girls started to giggle. I sat down and tossed Willie his chocolate milk. I said, "Hi, so you think you're safe to sit with me today?" "Yeah, I think so. Looks like you're still famous." I nodded and bit into my peanut butter sandwich. "Yeah, I guess I'm going to have to learn to live with it." I leaned my head back to take a long drink of milk, but I stopped. Something was wrong with Willie, with his face. Willie looked like one of those kids in Jurassic Park when the Tyrannosaurus Rex is trying to eat their car. I put my milk carton down and said, "What's wrong?" And Willie whispered, "Mrs. Carp, coming this way, fast." I turned around and Willie wasn't kidding. Mrs. Carp was heading across the cafeteria. Every kid was watching her. She had this awful look on her face, and she was walking fast and in a straight line toward us. She came right up to me, and I could feel my face turn white. My heart was pounding. Mrs. Carp glared down at me. She was so tall, and it looked like her face was made of stone. Without saying a word, she reached down and took hold of my arm right above the elbow. Then real loud she said, "You are coming to the office with me, right now." Willie looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Then Mrs. Carp turned around and started walking. She was still holding onto my arm, and it probably looked like she was dragging me across the cafeteria. And as we walked past, with everyone staring at me in this loud voice, Mrs. Carp said, "We have some things to talk about, young man, about the ropes in gym class, and about your behavior in the art room, and about something that happened Tuesday out on the playground." I looked up, and at one of the lunch tables, Danny Grumson was smiling at me and nodding his head. Then he put out his pointer finger and pulled it, zip, straight across his throat. As Mrs. Carp pulled me across the big room, I felt myself start to blush, and I thought, that's the last time I'll ever trust a principal. I thought I was so smart to go and talk to her. Now she's probably going to call my mom and dad, too. Then we were out the door, down the steps, along the front hallway, and into her office. I hate it when I feel like I'm going to cry, especially at school. But that's how I felt. I kept my eyes on the floor. I sat in the chair in front of Mrs. Carp's desk, and when I heard her sit in her chair, I looked up at her. And then I looked away real quick and then looked back again, because I couldn't believe my eyes. Mrs. Carp was smiling, a big, warm, friendly smile. I kept staring at her, and she said, "How was that?" I shook my head. "What? How was what?" "My performance. How did you like my performance?" And Mrs. Carp kept on smiling. "I guess it was pretty good if it fooled you, too. Sorry, but I had to make it look real." I shook my head, still trying to understand. "Then you're not mad at me?" She shook her head, still smiling. "No, not at all. Remember this morning when I told you I'd think about your problem? Well, I did. And what just happened? That was my solution." And that's when I got it. It was all an act. I said, "But the ropes in gym class, I really did that." Mrs. Carp said, "I talked with Mr. Collins, and he understands everything, and you will be doing more push-ups and sit-ups tomorrow." "In art class?" I asked. "Yes, Miss Cott will be making quite a big speech to you on Friday about how wrong it was to destroy school property. Which is true, of course. You shouldn't have broken that paintbrush." Then Mrs. Carp looked at her watch. "Well, I think it's safe for you to go back and have the rest of your lunch now. But remember, Jake, this has to be your secret, or it's going to look like I've given you special treatment, and we wouldn't want anyone to think that, now would we?" And at that moment, if Mrs. Carp had wanted to pat me on the head, I wouldn't have minded one bit. So that was how the longest 4 days of my life finally ended, and I never told anyone about Mrs. Carp's great performance, not even Willie. The rest of my lunch tasted great that Thursday, and I wish you could have seen the way everyone looked at me when I walked back into the cafeteria and sat down to eat. Some kids looked at me like I was an escaped criminal. Some kids looked at me like I was a hero coming back from a war. Some kids looked at me like they were afraid to look at me, but nobody, not one kid, not one teacher, not one cafeteria, looked at me like I had ever been Jake Drake, teacher's pet.